Hello and welcome everyone. As the room is starting to populate, we welcome everyone to SIETAR Europa's Anti-Racism Learning Series. This is the 10th installment of our series and we welcome each of you. Please feel free to let us know in the chat where you're logging in from. Hello, Rosalind from Paris, thank you. Those of you who've been here before know the routine. So once again, please let us know in the chat where you're logging in from. And we'll give it just about one more minute before we begin to allow folks to arrive. So once again, I welcome everybody to SIETAR Europa's Anti-Racism Learning Series. This is the 10th installment of our series. And today we're talking about the intersectionality of race, gender identity, and sexual orientation, which is missing from the title. And that's my shortcoming. But I'm looking forward to our conversation today to discuss this topic. So I will introduce our speakers in a moment, but please welcome everyone and please feel free. Hello, Papa from Valencia, Spain. We've got folks here from the Netherlands, Nuremberg, France, Germany, Prague, Munich, Cambridge, UK. Hello and welcome. We have some folks here from Montreal, Canada, and Oregon. So it's really exciting to see folks from around the world. And myself and Yvonne Vanderpool and Papa Bala Ndong from the SIETAR Europa board. We are your hosts and moderators for today. And so we're looking forward to engaging with all of you. So once again, thank you and welcome everyone to SIETAR Europa's Anti-Racism Learning Series. We thank you so much for your participation in our series. It's just one of the steps that we are taking as an organization to educate ourselves and our members on anti-racism and its intersectionality with the intercultural field and our diverse identities. We want to, we start each of our sessions with our community guidelines. And so we're gonna post those in the chat, but I really just wanna share and remind each of us, each of you, that we are responsible for creating a positive learning environment and self-managing as we really all are working collectively together to participate in these critical and often difficult conversations on race and identity. And to ensure that we have a safe and inclusive and positive learning environment, we ask all attendees to assume positive intent, practice curiosity, listen to learn and understand, reserve judgment, and manage your emotions, use inclusive language, apply critical thinking to new ideas. The entire purpose of these conversations is to hear new ideas and to be challenged. And so challenge your own perceptions and bias. And we know that each month within the series, you all actively engage and participate in the chat, and we appreciate that. And we encourage you to continue to do so and to share resources and to remember to be respectful and courteous to one another, to our guests, to our facilitators. Yvonne and Papa will be moderating the chat, and we will have time for question and answer at the end of our session today. And so please feel free to use the Q&A feature to put any questions that you want to ask when we get to the end of our session to the question and answer period. So with all that, thank you all. Again, my name is Tamara Thorpe. I am the president of the SIETAR Europa board and the representative from SIETAR Ireland. And I'm really pleased to be here today with three incredible human beings that I feel quite fortunate to know and have been incredible sources of leadership, mentorship, and knowledge for me in my own journey and understanding race, sexuality, culture, and identity, and all of its intersections. And so I am more than honored and excited about all the knowledge they're going to bring to us today. So I want to start by doing a quick introduction. Their bios are on the website, so I don't want to spend too much time, but I don't want to not acknowledge their brilliant accolades. So first we have Dr. Joel Brown, who was the Chief Visionary Officer for Numos. He's based in San Francisco and specializes in cultural intelligence, leadership, change management, strategic storytelling. Joel is also a poet and somebody who identifies very strongly as a global citizen. He's been very active in our SIETAR network and is both a member of SIETAR USA and SIETAR Europa. And Joel was named as an adjunct professor at the IESEG Management School in Lille, Paris, where I think you just recently were contributing. And does courses on strategic storytelling and story listening. And you design programs that focus on dialogue, LGBTQ inclusion, and male leadership. And did your doctorate on the topic with your dissertation, which was entitled, "What Does It Mean to Be Gay? An Examination of the Cultural Values of Gay Men." So I am so pleased to have you here and excited to learn more from you and your work today. So hello, Joel. Thank you for being here. We also have Dr. Justin Citron, a longtime friend and colleague as well. Justin is an associate dean in the College of Health and Human Services at Widener University, where he also serves as the director of the Interdisciplinary Sexuality Research Collaborative. I can say that for a long time, I knew Justin did work around sexuality and culture, and I didn't really know what that meant. And then the first time, after encouraging him, please come into the SIETAR community and share with us the work you were doing, when he did, like, my mind blew open, just completely expanded my understanding of the topic. And so I know today we are going to learn so much from the work that he has done and continues to do in this area. And lastly, Rita Wubler, who is president and founder of Interglobe Cross-Cultural Business Services. And I think I've known you the longest out of everybody here. And when we first met at a SIETAR USA Congress, and you are a bicultural, bilingual, and binational facilitator, consultant, and coach, whose work is really committed to building bridges across cultures, combining your work in intercultural competence, intercultural competence building, and a passion for creating diversity and inclusive work environments globally and domestically, work that you've been doing for, that she's been doing for 25 years. She is the co-founder of the LGBTQ Special Interest Group within SIETAR and the co-author of The Cultural Detective, Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Trans Culture. So I don't think we could possibly have three more qualified SIETArians with us today to have this conversation. So let's get into it. And I want to start with Joel. Our conversation today is about intersectionality, and specifically the intersection of race, racism, and people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, and others, including people whose gender is expansive, non-binary, or non-conforming to societal norms. So let's start with the basics. Can you define for us intersectionality?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody for participating. I want to thank you, Tamara, for being, a very innovative and thoughtful leader. I think you, in many ways, are unrecognized or don't get as much recognition as you should for the work that you do for SIETAR Europa. So I just want to first pause and thank you for that. I also just want to thank everybody for being here, because we live in a world where it's still not easy to be LGBTQ or an ally. And I also hope that everybody's taking care of themselves with the pandemic. I know, particularly in some parts of Europe, particularly France, people are still experiencing a lockdown. So I hope you all are wearing a mask and that you're being safe. Now that that's all out of the way, okay? Intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And Kimberly Crenshaw is a professor here in the United States. And initially, Dr. Crenshaw was used or came up with this phrase intersectionality because she was looking at and looked at a lawsuit that was filed against General Motors in the US back in the 1970s by a group of Black women who were saying, complaining that they had been laid off and that they were also looking at wages and working conditions and wanted to combine or have a claim that included, was based on sex and race. And the courts at the time said that they could not do so because it would open a Pandora's box for protected classes or groups against which you could not, where there was heightened scrutiny in terms of discrimination cases. So I don't want to get too far down the legal path on that, but what she basically recognized and what was basically at issue in that particular case was the fact that women, if the Black women had sued strictly based on sex, there were in fact women in the company, white women, who were doing better. So those claims probably would not have been addressed, or they probably would not have been successful on the merits of their lawsuit because white women were doing well. And they couldn't necessarily sue based on race because Black men were doing well or doing better than, and they did not have similar situations or similar circumstances to what they were facing. So they face a quandary, they face a dilemma of how do we actually address some of the particular issues that are facing Black women, which are were difficult to litigate because of the intersectionality of their racial identity and their gender identity. Now, typically when people talk about intersectionality, what they're talking about is the intersection of different parts of our identity that create nuanced forms of discrimination and create nuanced forms of privilege. And I would like to put it in more positive terms. The way that we talk about intersectionality when we do this work is the synergy that is created by different aspects of your identity. So for example, as you think about your world lens, as you think about your pathway throughout the world, as you think about who you are, and particularly in thinking about being a queer or a gay man, it is not simple enough, or I can't simply just talk about that without also examining how race and how a number of different factors impact what that journey is like. And one of the things that I will be talking about later is this whole idea that when we talk about the pathway, the experience, and the culture of the LGBTQ community across the world, but let's say just in our own respective regions, how a lot of times that identity, that pathway, that experience has been whitewashed, or it has been male washed, or it has been cisgender washed in a certain way that ignores and obscures the pathways of others or does not take into account intersectionality in a real way. So that was probably more that many of you on this call wanted to know about the origins of intersectionality, but I want to just reinforce that once again, this came from Kimberly Crenshaw, and this was based on a class action lawsuit, or not a class action lawsuit, a lawsuit that was brought back in the 70s here in the US by a group of Black women whose situation and circumstances were quite particular to them being Black women.
Thank you, Joel. I think that context is super important. And does really outline sort of the importance of the idea of intersectionality and how it manifests not only from the institutionalized way in which racism and sexism are embedded into our systems, but as you said, into this sort of synergy of identity that you mentioned. So thank you for that. And I know the researchers who are here are very excited by all that you shared. And so for you, Rita, as the co-founder of the LGBTQ SIG within SIETAR and the co-author of the Cultural Detective module, I see you as someone who recognized the intersectionality between the intercultural field and the LGBTQ community very early. So can you tell us what that intersection is from your perspective?
Yes, good afternoon and good morning, Tamara and colleagues and esteemed friends. I always feel like I have half a foot, well, half a body, 1 foot in Europe and 1 foot here in the US. So I'm glad that I get to be standing on both sides now for the next 90 minutes. And thanks for inviting us and thanks for being here, like Joel said. So I'd like to add a personal story to Joe's explanations, and the words that I can pick up on from your telling of the context or giving of the context are dilemma and synergy, Joe. So thank you for those. So I have been a SIETAR member for a long time, and my first conference was in 1990. And then I started coming back because that like so many of us, I feel like I had found a home of sorts, professionally for sure, but also, you know, with other parts of myself. And so when I went to my second and third conferences, those were international conferences at the time. One was in Curacao and another one was in Jamaica, all these cool places. And I'd come out as a lesbian maybe not even that long before then, 6 years or so. I found myself feeling like, yeah, so we're talking about differences, but what about me? What about my differences? What about my sexual orientation that, you know, I didn't feel reflected in any of the language in SIETAR, in any of the proposals or the presentations. So I started talking to some people, some colleagues, and there was one man named Roger Schaff, who is in California, who became my co-conspirator. And the two of us and a few others started sort of almost plotting, you might say, behind closed doors about how can we make SIETAR as an organization more inclusive / more aware even of, you know, of this difference around sexual orientation at the time and gender identity, of course, also. And so we realized that they didn't even have a, in their, what I don't know, was called in their statement of non-discrimination, they didn't even include sexual orientation at the time. This was in the early 1990s. So we thought, well, that's the first thing we can change. So we made an official application to please include that into their bylaws, and they did. And then from then on, we became sort of official, and it was very welcoming mostly, but also with a little bit of like, who are you, you know, and why are you different, and why do you want a special treatment here? And so, but over time, over the years, of course, the SIG that we then named Pride Across Cultures became a very established SIG, along with the other ones that we've been having in SIETAR for many years now. So I think just by the fact that the value that SIETAR holds of bridging differences, of developing people and their cultural competence, you know, it's obviously it ties right into, you know, with integrating different sexual orientations and gender identities. And so it took that sort of personal work behind closed doors and then more openly for us to, you know, bring it into the culture more explicitly. And ever since then, we've really made sure that we've had proposals submitted, presentations on a variety of different topics. And so we've extended this from, you know, when we became more national SIETARs, that we were represented in, you know, in Europe and Germany and wherever else we were gonna go. And so the one thing about LGBT cultures, it's very community-based. And so there's always people that you can draw on, which is very typical of minorities in general. And so we built that network and we still have it. And I feel, you know, a certain sense of pride across cultures, of having been able to create this with so many others, or co-create it with so many others. So that's what I would like to say to that.
Thank you so much. And I remember some of that pushback, you know, years ago when I was involved with SIETAR USA on the scholarship committee. And we had funds set aside explicitly for LGBTQ candidates. And I remember people having that conversation of, you know, well, why should we have these separate funds? And I think, you know, all this last year, we hear from our clients in our community, well, why is there such a focus on racism? Or why is there such a focus on anti-Blackness? And I think it's, you know, we can focus on lots of things at one time. And if we don't take the time to focus on one thing, we're going to really miss how we can create change systemically and miss opportunities to learn. So this focus is so important. And for you to have seen the growth and the expansion over time of your work is brilliant and some incredible leadership. So Joel, so Justin, your work, as I said, in sexuality, education, and culture certainly transformed my understanding of sexuality and culture. So can you tell us more about the intersectionality between culture and sexuality?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today, Tamara. And It's very exciting to be on a panel with two people who I call friends and who are fantastic fellow LGBTQ SIETArians. First, I want to acknowledge that I am on the ancestral lands of the Lenape people here in the eastern part of the United States. I'm just outside of Philadelphia between Washington, D.C. and New York City. As people have shared, we're all currently in North America right now. And I think as I get into talking the way I talk about sex and culture and sexuality and culture, I want to just ask everybody for a little forgiveness and understanding that the language I'm going to use is language I'm most comfortable with in the context that I am in here in the US. And I know that the particular dynamics around intercultural understanding in sexuality, when we're talking as Americans and Europeans, particularly North Americans and Europeans, there's a limited scope of what we're talking about. And then I'm hoping to kind of expand it to the broader global context, but while at the same time acknowledging that I'm going to tend to talk in very Euro-American terms. So when I think about culture, there's lots of different ways scholars in the cultural world describe culture, and each discipline sort of has its perspective. But the definition I tend to lean on, because of the work I do that's very field-based in training community people, but also people who work in community, is that culture is a system of socially agreed upon norms that are reinforced or punished or rewarded or disincentivized. And so when we think about something like gender, there are ways in which every culture of the world encourages people because of their gender to behave and engage in the world, and things that people are discouraged. And we know that the arc of sort of the Euro-American context has been to provide more access to more people around gender equality, gender equity. And so culture is the system of rewards and benefits and punishments and disincentives. So that's the first part of that. Sexuality is interesting because there was a period of time in the 90s when folks really started to push us away from thinking about sex when we think about sexuality and think more about the identities we hold, things like our sexual orientation or attraction, our gender identity. And while it's been really helpful in centering individual identity and agency, it really prioritizes a very individualist, identity-based cultural framework that doesn't really work for a lot of cultures and communities around the world. But it also kind of set aside sexual behavior itself. And at the end of the day, our sexuality from an identity perspective is based on a basic sexual behavior that people engage in. And so what I like to encourage us to think back to is paring down sexuality to its most basic parts, which are our body, our psychology, and the way in which we use those things in the world. And some people have access to use those things a lot, and some people have limited or even barriers to their access of those things. For example, transgender folks, often people want to support the identity of a trans person, but struggle to empower folks to explore their sexuality and live through sexual behavior in ways that are really holistic for a person. And like as trans people, LGBT people, those things are not separate within us. They are a part of who we are. So intersectionality also includes the ways in which our sexual body is experienced by ourselves and the ways in which we share or don't share that and the ways in which we access our power in it. And so if we think about human existence, like the only reason there are more humans is because people decided to have sex, whether they did that consensually with each other or one person pursued it with another person. Like that is the basic foundation of human existence. And when we look at that through a lens of anti-racism, what we see is a whole system for hundreds of years where particularly cisgender white men create a whole bunch of rules and policies, informal and formal, that restricted who had access to controlling their own reproduction. And so in the US context during slavery, enslaved people were required to bear children. And that still lives on in the Black experience in the United States. It still lives on in a lot of the experience of people in Africa who experienced colonization by white Europeans and then had their literal bodies treated as objects. And so I think if we think all the way back to that, it gives us a very different insight into sexuality and culture, and helps us see that when we create rules around gender-based pay equity, part of what we're doing is more than just paying women the same as men, or paying all people, whether you're a man, woman, trans, or gender expansive, in a fair way. But we're also giving people the resources to take care of their sexual body that then will carry on through the generations to come. And there's been a lot of work done around the world in the name of public health that has really restricted people's access to sexual agency, access to being able to reproduce, access to not contract or transmit sexually transmitted infections and things. So that's sort of where I go when I think about intersectionality. And I really like to push these conversations about LGBTQ sexuality to think also about the behaviors that we engage in, because LGBTQ folks for the last 20 to 40 years have really been pushed to be part of like the mainstream culture. And in a lot of ways, that mainstream culture itself harms us. And so assimilating into it really can actually be problematic. And so when we see internationally resistance around LGBTQ rights in places outside of Europe and the North American regions, a lot of that is less about the behaviors people engage in and more about this very Western or European American idea of what sex and sexuality are being thrust upon cultures where it is way more complicated if we look at it through that cultural lens of the cultural frameworks we know to use as interculturalists. And just something as simple as like American marriages being prioritized as romantic versus a relationship between two family systems. And like that, those two differences which are more kind of two extremes, really change what it means to be a lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, or trans person. The last thing I'll say is LGBTQ plus people, intersex, asexual people, have been a part of the human family since the very first ancestors of humans walked the earth. And so we need to remember that these terms that we are using are really only become commonplace in the last few decades and the last half century. And even before that, really are only about 150 years old. And so if we think about the experience of people, these identities can also really get in our way of thinking much more broadly and more fluidly. And I think when it comes to gender identity and what transgender perspectives are really pushing us to think about is, are we able to be more expansive in who we're including, and realizing that like the more LGBTQ folks have rights and access to themselves, the more everyone will, because our oppression is linked to everyone's problematic systems.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that that's the journey, right? Is that expansive piece. So thank you. So to build on that, Joel, specifically, how help us now understand this intersection that Justin was talking about racism and its intersection with sexuality, and then its impact, of course, on your experience.
I wish we had a full day to have this conversation and maybe something bubbly so that we could talk about this as to give it the treatment that I think it deserves. I think I want to just take a step back and first of all, think about what the experience is like for whether you identify as BIPOC, whether you identify as a person of color, whether you identify as a BAME, Black, Asian, minority ethnicity as is used in some parts of Europe. and think about our experience, not only through the lens of enslavement, but also through the lens of colonialism and imperialism. So I think it's important for us to talk about that. And if we are being honest and talking about those experiences, we have to recognize that for many of us, there has not been freedom of the body, there has not been freedom of the tongue, there's not been freedom of thought, there's not been freedom of movement, there's not been freedom of spirit. And the reason why I think it's important to talk about that is because that then impacts your ability to be present and to recognize your place within the LGBTQ community. And it also can speak to how you may be looked at within the LGBTQ community at times. I want to offer a little bit of a story that I think will help to illustrate where I'm coming from. So I've had the privilege of being out now for 26 years. Oh my gosh, I'm getting old. And so I've been in situations where I remember once going into a location in Boston, Massachusetts, a gay establishment or a queer establishment. And as I was walking in, the gentleman who was checking IDs grabbed me by the arm and he said to me, "Do you know that this is an LGBTQ establishment?" And I said, "Yes." But the implication was that because of how I looked and because of who I am, that somehow I was seen as being other and different. On the flip side, and I have had situations, I know many of my friends have had the experience of being in LGBTQ establishments and LGBTQ venues and fora where people are looking at me because of what they believe to be physical attributes, but my voice has been silenced, I have been seen, I have not been taken seriously. So a couple of years ago, I had the privilege of attending the National Lesbian and Gay, well, actually, let me just make sure I'm remembering the acronym correctly. It'll come to me in just a second. I was attending an LGBTQ conference in Prague. And if I closed my eyes and didn't know where I was, I could have sworn that I was somewhere in the US, but I was in the middle of Europe. And the same conversations were taking place within Europe as were taking place in the US, in terms of people not feeling seen, in terms of people not feeling heard, in terms of people feeling objectified, in terms of people themselves grappling with the issue of how do I integrate this identity, and also recognizing that at times coming out as LGBTQ, however you define that, can also make you a minority, or it makes you a minority, but also makes you a target within a subset of our society, within these BIPOC communities, where we have typically looked for refuge or sought refuge and sought a particular haven. So it's a very complex thing. And I would say to you, on one hand, the thing that I think I would like for all of us to start to think about is when we talk about LGBTQ community, what does that really mean? And who exactly is defining what that means to be LGBTQ? Oftentimes, and the reason why I did my doctoral work and continue to do research is because the definition, the framing, the look of what that means has been defined by people based on their privilege and their power, but not really looking once again at intersectionality. So you're having basically gay men or cisgender people and white people, and this extends into Europe as well, who are making statements about what it means to be LGBTQ without having done the necessary research and had the necessary dialogue and conversations to say, what is my lens including and necessarily excluding? And a lot of times what people define as being LGBTQ culture is oftentimes whiteness that is dressed up as LGBTQ culture. And it is a particular form of whiteness. And I also want to be very clear about that too. And that doesn't mean, of course, that our communities have not been influenced and supported by all of us. But I find that the definition and the experience and the worldview have been very narrowly tailored. So for me, when I think about the LGBTQ community, I'm not only thinking about, sexuality and psychology, I'm also thinking about community. I'm also thinking about power, and I'm also thinking about privilege. And those are the conversations that are not being had enough to say, well, who are the spokespeople? Who are the most visible people? How is it getting defined? And the thing that frankly stresses me sometimes is that for this community that I love and cherish, what I'm seeing from the West is an exportation of a superficial idea as to what the community is all around the world, that not only, to Justin's point, disrespects what is there in some of the native regions or some of the local regions, but is also not fully, and I think accurately describing and giving breath to the community, the cultures, even in North America. So for example, when I'm talking to and examining and having conversations with friends, colleagues, and peers around what the conversation, what it means to be LGBTQ, I'm not seeing that necessarily reflected in how these things are talked about by influencers and by social commentators, or even by some researchers as well. It is very much coming from a very power-based, privileged lens. And so that's where I want us to start having deeper conversation to recognize, not that someone's experience being, let's say, a white lesbian from Oakland is not important, but recognizing that it shouldn't be normative for everybody else, and that there's a challenge and I think a danger in creating this universality to say, well, it's this. I think there are some common values, and that was part of my research and is part of my ongoing research, but the ways in which those things get expressed can look different and should not be, there should not be this pressure or this idea that there's one modality or one way in which cultural values get expressed and how people talk about who they are, or what are the symbolic aspects of who we are as LGBTQ people. So I'm going to pause there because of course, there's more discussion to be had, but that's been my experience. And I can tell you from a personal lens, I even to this day can still walk into spaces all around the world. And I've had the privilege of visiting 46 countries. I spent a lot of time in Europe. I'm hoping to be adopted by someone in Europe at some point so I can actually gain residency, where people are still shocked to know that I'm LGBTQ, and they're still expecting me to show up in ways that are white, male, cisgender normative based, that are very exclusive to people who don't fall into those molds, into those definitions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Joel. I know all that you shared is so critical, and I know for me, I had never, all those things you explained. I mean, I remember the moment I was at the White Privilege Conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when it was in Albuquerque. And it was the first time that I had awareness brought to me of that impact of whiteness and cisgendered and male privilege in the LGBTQ plus community. And again, like so many moments, it was such a revelatory moment for me in recognizing the intersectionality of race in the LGBT community, and recognizing the role of whiteness. So it's, you know, we had 2 sessions in this series from Natasha Aralaya on whiteness, and recognizing how that has played out not in the LGBT community, and then specifically, right, within the European and North American context. And then for us to start thinking about it as interculturalists, what both you and Justin have brought attention to is, what's the impact then of this norm being exported globally to cultures who have dealt with it and identified it and classified it in very different ways. And for me, that's something that is tons of food of thought going on in my mind as we're having this conversation. And so for you, Rita, what has been your experience around this intersectionality?
Yeah, so what Joel just outlined and brought up, I think there's a lot of truth that you spoke, Joel, and the caution that you put out there for us not to, you know, get sucked into this sort of tendency to use this one group as the norm. I mean, with any human being, there's tons and tons of stories, and because I think we're part of a minority, we're often seen as, you know, like, so you speak for all of the lesbians in America or whatever it might be. So that's, of course, a very valid point that you made, Joel, and thank you for that. Yeah, it's a very complex question. For myself personally, I think because of my background as an immigrant of German descent, landing in the US in my late 20s as a straight woman, and then coming, you know, on my own journey to the realization, actually, you know, I think I'm gay, you know, and then embracing that. And initially feeling like I finally found my people, my tribe. I felt like, you know, my community was there to embrace me. And it felt like, yeah, a new sort of lease on life in some ways. Coming out later in life, I think has that impact on you sometimes. Then to realize, you know, yeah, then I'm being seen as a certain group now, white, privileged for sure, female. So those are some strikes, quote unquote, against you, right? If you especially show up in the workplace or in professional contexts, having to compete against, you know, white male consultants and so initially I was very reluctant to even come out in professional context, to even say that I'm gay, because I wasn't quite clear about it myself, or wasn't feeling safe enough to do this. And then I was getting messages like, you know, you're already kind of lesser than, and then on top of that, you're also gay. So anyway, so that was my initial, maybe the first 6-10 years of my professional life as a lesbian. And then more and more colleagues would say, well, you're not really helping the cause, Rita. I'm like, I know, but I also need to feel safe about this. And so I was struggling, and eventually through a lot of my own internal work, I just became clearer about who I was and what I wanted to do with my identity in a professional context when it was relevant. And so I then began to claim it more and, you know, brought it as part of my teaching, so to speak, to the table. And now we're in a very different time again. I've been around for, as you said, decades in this field. Now I have a much different awareness myself of my white privilege, of my whiteness. I was married to a Black Canadian woman for 4 years, lived in Canada, experienced life as a white spouse of a Black woman who actually ran for public office for a number of years. So I was the candidate's wife, which was a totally new role for me. And thinking naively that in Canada things are, you know, different and more open and more progressive. Well, they really weren't. There was as much racism there that, you know, I would encounter in Germany or in the US. Different type of racism because of historical reasons, but still. And then coming back to the US, and now where we find ourselves, you know, in the COVID times, witnessing the trial against the murder of George Floyd and all these kind of things. There's a lot of stuff that I think makes me feel right now like I'm in flux. The influence of class, for instance, so when I talk to Black colleagues, it's very much depending on what is their age, what is their class, and how does that all intersect with one another. So the other intersection is, I think, class, that we still don't talk enough about. So there's an example of about this story in a book that I really very much appreciate by Ijeoma Oluo, which is called "So You Want to Talk About Race." I'm sure that some of you have read this book, and she talks about she lives in Seattle, how she and her friends finally found a safe space for their group of more like artsy Black folks to gather in this park, and this group of, you know, younger Black men would came up playing basketball and say, hey, what are you guys doing here? Can we join you? Feeling sort of some kinship, you know, just based on the, you know, on the fact that they were from the same race. And she realizing in herself, she wasn't really open to embracing them because they were not from her class background as she perceived it. And so the whole group became kind of, became a little flustered, and then eventually they kind of made space and, you know, invited those younger men in, but the intersection of race and class there was not really explored at all until much later, she said, and she realized that she had a lot of work to do there herself as well. So all this is to say that it's a very complex topic and the learning never ends, but that's kind of a cliche, but so yeah, that's what I would like to contribute to that question, and turning it over to Justin, I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it is the journey, and I think, you know, to your point, that given where we are today and with all that's happening, that this is a journey we all need to be a part of, and the world is recognizing that we all need to be a part of this journey, making it this sort of collective that also can be quite overwhelming. I know I certainly have that experience. And so, Justin, for you, what has the intersectionality of race, racism, and sexuality been? What is your experience?
So I would say that I completely underscore everything that Rita and Joel said. I think I've witnessed a lot of what they both described. So I'm going to add sort of like my own personal layer. So I am a white queer man, and I am the child, I'm the third generation child of immigrants to the US who were Jewish from Eastern Poland. And my mom's family, I would be sixth generation immigrants from Ireland. And I bring up that particular piece because it has really, like, I grew up as a relatively new family to the US in comparison to lots of folks where I grew up, especially because I grew up in a rural place about an hour and a half from here. And growing up in an interfaith family, like when my parents got married, it was like both of their families did not want that to happen. Jews and Catholics don't get together. You know, it was a whole thing. And so then I was born the first of my siblings. And when I started to sort of come into my own awareness that, like, I was different. So first of all, I was very gender nonconforming as a child. So I was bullied and harassed for being a sissy, or people actually perceived me to be a girl for most of my childhood. So I was constantly in this wrestling match with people around me that, like, no, I'm a boy, even though I don't behave that way. And because of my parents' liberal experience of their own relationship, they really raised us to be whoever we wanted to be. And when I first came to realize that I was gay or queer, it was one of those moments where I was like, not another thing that makes me different. Like, I really don't want that. And especially because in so many ways I blended into the very white place that I was. And so when I went to college and ended up at a Catholic university, like, the folks that I gathered with were the other minorities on campus. So the LGBTQ folks and the people of color. And that was sort of when I realized, sort of very fast, that I had a lot of racist ideas in my head that I was taught by the community around me. Because as I started to make true friendships with people of color for the first time in my 20s, I realized, like, wow, we're more similar than we are different, and that our differences are actually very interesting and something I want to know more about. And it's interesting in intercultural work where we talk about, like, curiosity as a skill, and being interested is a skill itself. Whereas as a interfaith queer kid who's gender nonconforming, like, I always had to figure out the world around me more for my own safety and preservation. But what I started to realize when I started to make friends who were people of color, especially Black folks in college, I realized that, like, I had a lot of problematic ideas about what Black meant, about how Black people were in the world. And so I'm really grateful to those folks in college who really held me and pushed me at times when I was probably pretty insufferable to be around. And I think that so much informs my experience today. And so when I started to learn things like the patriarchy and white hegemony and the impact of colonization on the American experience, and how that experience was different for enslaved people and immigrants and, you know, quote unquote, white native people who are really not at all native to the continent. I started to really realize like I kind of came with a little bit of a predisposition to understanding the experience of people who find themselves marginalized. But as I started to learn more about the patriarchy and particularly the European American brand of it, I then started to learn as a young gay person that a lot of these, like when I first came out, so much of the experience was like, have you ever been with a woman? Are you a gold star gay, or are you tainted? Or are you platinum because you didn't even, you weren't even born vaginally, you were born out of a C-section. And like, that stuff was part of the gay white culture that I was like coached through in the beginning to like join the community. And as I started learning about sexuality, and particularly the sex part of it, I started to realize that like this very anti-vulva and anti-vagina narrative among white gay men is problematic on so many levels, but really is alienating to our lesbian and trans sisters and brothers and gender nonconforming people, and really builds in white gay men a callousness and a kind of hatred toward people whose gender is different. And that is just like so problematic, because we all need each other. And I think collectivism and the solidarity approaches to these movements really help us see how much we are getting in our own way by doing that. And so a lot of the work I try to do with my friends is like catching those things when they happen and stopping it. But also really unpacking in myself how much of that hatred is born from a kind of homophobia and self-hate that as queer men or gay men we have. And honestly, like I identify as a queer person more because of that radical critique that I have. Because like saying gay man for me brings up all that sexism and problematic racism that I just don't want to be affiliated with and want to dismantle. Yeah, and then I think when we lay on then the layer of gender identity and gender expression, like my own trauma as a gender nonconforming young person has taken me till my 40s to really unpack that like my own sense of transphobia about my own gender experience makes me a troubled ally at times to trans people, because I gotta figure that crap out so that I can show up for trans people in a way that is really about their experience and not the problematic internalized experience I've had. And it also has taught me that like we have things in common, and that the more I fight for trans folks to be able to express themselves however they want, the more I feel comfortable wearing my hair longer and wearing bright colors and painting my fingernails, right? And like, that's important too. And if we think about gender globally, there are so many more ways to think about gender than the European American patriarchal sexist lens. And there are matriarchies all over the planet that create very different gender norms and expectations for societies where that is the predominant perspective. And I think we have a lot to learn as a queer community from gender nonconforming and matriarchal cultures around the world. But we have to like set aside that exportation lens of like pride and the corporatization of pride, because it all happens to this very capitalist perspective and not from a perspective that really centers everyday lived experiences of the people on the ground. So.
Thank you. And I want to turn over to you, Joel, because I know that you want to connect with some of the things that Justin was saying. And I think what you shared, Justin, is really powerful, because, you know, part of where I want to look at next is how does this show up within the LGBTQ plus community, and what do folks who are in the community and people who are here, and what you know, how do we respond to this? So I will turn it over to you, Joel.
And I'm going to make this brief because I think Rita's in the queue, so I'm going to make this very brief. I just wanted to say, I know I am speaking from the African-American experience and from the Black experience. And I also just want to recognize too, that in terms of how these things show up in terms of objectification and fetishization, the experiences I've talked to my friends who are, did you all lose me? Am I still there? Okay, great. Who are Asian, Latinx as well. Those.
So Joel, your sound is cutting out a bit. Looks like. Okay, so it looks like we've lost Joel.
No,
He's back.
I'm back.
All right, great.
All right, well, that wasn't fun. What I was basically saying, the fetishizing and some of the objectification is
yeah, we're losing sound with you, Joel. So every time you start to talk, we don't hear you, which is terrible because I really want to hear what you have to say. So what I will do is we'll give you a minute to recheck your sound. And I will ask Rita, thinking about some of the things that Justin has shared, in what ways have you experienced, witnessed, or really responded to racism within the community, within the LGBTQ community, and some of those intersections that Justin really identified?
Yeah, I think so. We have to take this sort of based on a local level, right? So I live in Atlanta, which is in the Southeast, which has its own very distinct history with racism. It's often called, more in tourist brochures, the cradle of civil rights movement. Well, that is where most of the civil rights struggles, I think, happened and still happen. So we also just helped vote in a Democratic Senate in the US Senate. So that was another thing in our state that we're very proud of. So looking at the LGBT community here, it is actually probably pretty much a reflection of general sort of life, at least in the US context, if I can just respond to that. That's what I know most about because I live most of my life here in the US. It's very segregated socially. And while there's there's some spaces where people can interact that are across races, so to speak. One of the things that happens in the LGBT culture, or has happened at least here, is that we're losing a lot of our social spaces. So bars are becoming quote unquote mainstream or actually closing down, especially for women. And that's not that we spend our lives in bars, but that is a place where traditionally LGBTQ people spend a lot of time to, interact and hang out, so to speak. So we're losing those spaces. Some are becoming mainstream. And again, it depends on sort of what socioeconomic group you're talking about and what age group you're talking about. But certainly, while we have seen progress, there's still examples of racism that are pretty blatant. For instance, in Atlanta, one of our most often frequented bar establishments by white people and Blacks, but 3 years ago or thereabouts, I think is when it was, they initiated a policy that was sort of very thinly veiled racist policy in my mind. They said they were talking about they needed a new fashion code, and so they put something, in their fashion policy around sagging pants are not allowed, which that clearly was aimed at Black young males who might be dressed in sagging pants more than their white counterparts. And so that kind of institutional racism is still there, and it got, of course, a lot of pushback, and they had to change it, and so the discussion was lively in the community. But the fact that it happened was, of course, sort of telling, and still a part of the time, or a sign of the time, that we are nowhere where we want to be in terms of equality. But we have a very active, gay newspaper that sort of puts these things or takes these things up. But the history of racism, of discrimination, that's pretty blatant, even though it's on the surface, we've passed laws and so forth to protect us against it. But, along with the voter suppression laws that we just passed in Georgia, this awful Senate Bill 202, which is clearly aimed at Black populations getting the vote out. So that's kind of a reflection of how this all intersects, you might say, right? Voting rights versus equal rights for LGBT people. And so there's a lot of overlap there. So yeah, as a white person of privilege, I hear stories, and I'm certainly an ally to those kinds of things when that happens. And it's still not where we need to be at all. It's way off there. And then again, we have hopeful moments. We have a very active women's bookstore that has been around for 45 years, a privately owned bookstore whose mission it has been for at least 30 of those 40 years to build bridges and to support anybody, no matter what race they are, and especially Black lesbians. And so that's been very ongoing effort and been very active. Yeah, but in general, we have lots of work to do still, and so it never ends.
Thanks so much, Rita. Joel.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I got scared for a minute. What I wanted to say too is I wanted to call on the experience of those who are API and Latinx and also Indigenous, because I don't want this to be something where the Black experience overshadows the cultural narratives of those who are from those communities who are also LGBTQ+. I just wanted to do that. I also wanted to state that from an anti-racism framework, when we're talking about white supremacy, we have to understand that white supremacy doesn't just impact how we hold race, but also impacts how we hold gender and also how we hold sexuality as well. So when you are talking or thinking about white supremacy means that you are heterosexist and that you are sexist, you're very patriarchal in your norms. And so you can't really divorce the two. And sometimes when I'm having conversations, frankly, with people who are in part of the Black community, I have to remind them that if you're homophobic, that you are also being beholden to white supremacy as well. And that's a whole different conversation, but it's one that I'm ready to have with anybody anytime they want to have it. I also think it's important for us, and I like to always make sure I have a balanced critique of the community. Studies have shown that LGBTQ people, on average, are more racially inclusive than their heterosexual counterparts. That is research. And I think there are one of the things I also want to remind people of, and I can only speak from the US context, but I also know it from other contexts as well across the globe, that frankly, in terms of the Black civil rights movement, the LGBTQ civil rights movement and the Black civil rights movement have been intertwined. So you can't really separate the two. A number of the leaders and those who are among the vanguard in the Black civil rights movement were queer. Whether we're talking about James Baldwin, whether we're talking about Bayard Rustin, Audre Lorde, there are a number of people, Harriet Tubman, there are a number of people. There's even, and this has been controversial, for example, but even people recognizing that, Malcolm X was on his own journey with sexuality as well. I'm sharing that is because it could be easy to look at our movements as being oppositional, but they're really not. And I would also say too, that in terms of my own experience of coming into the community, I have different experience than, let's say, obviously than Rita and Justin, in that, being after
So we've lost sound again. Oh. So I think we have lost Joel one more time. I think he's going to come back.
He's persistent. He'll be back.
He'll be back. Great. So we're at the top of the hour, and when Joel comes back, I'm going to make sure we have space for him to continue to make his point, because I think it's an important one. But part of what we want to do before we move into Q&A is to think about the role of allies. And so that's something that we really want to jump into in terms of what's going to be the roles of allies and intercultural practitioners and SIETArians. But I will turn it back over to Joel before we jump back into that. Joel?
This is so funny. So I just prayed to all the gods and goddesses and non-gender conforming deities to make sure that this does not continue to happen. But what I was pointing to before, I think I got lost, is the fact that there's a lot of intersection between the movements. And so, for example, with the Black Civil Rights Movement, there's a lot of intersection there in terms of our leaders and people who were helping in gender identity. And so there's a natural synergy there that I want us to tap into that I think will help us as we move forward. And I'm going to stop now before you lose my internet connection again. So.
Thank you, Joel. So with that, just what can allies do to amplify the voices of queer and trans people of color and stand up against racism as we are moving towards liberation from racism and the dismantling of social inequities?
Yeah. So I think one of the first things from my standpoint as a white cis queer person, I think we first need to get over the narrative that queer people are oppressed too, and our oppression is like just as important or as powerful as the oppression of people of color. The intersectional lens of LGBTQ communities really calls on us to see the difference between people of color in the community and white folks in the community. And white folks need to recognize that we can have privilege and oppression at the same time. So I think one of the first things we need to do as white allies is to recognize those two things and do our own work to unpack them and figure out, like I had said earlier, like how does my own stuff get in my way of doing that? Once we're over that hurdle, I think then what we need to look for is the ways in which sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and really gender binaries get in our own way. And we need to really be mindful when it comes particularly to queer and trans people of color, that we're in a position where we want to amplify, lift up, and empower the voices of trans and queer people of color. But we also have to be there to be supportive and caring about how that happens, because when queer and trans people of color do step up and speak out, they face a set of vulnerabilities that their white, queer, and trans peers don't experience. And so I think we can't only amplify voices if we're not going to come to the defense and support of those voices we amplify. And I think in the movement right now, there's a lot of tokenizing or objectification that's happening in an effort to amplify and lift up. And I think we have to be really mindful of that. And then the fetishization that Joel was talking about is part of that fine line, right? Like there are lots of white folks who are genuinely attracted to lots of different people, and because of the system of racism, find themselves to be more attracted to a person of color or a trans person. And I think that if we don't have a real rich understanding within ourselves of where that fetishization or objectification is coming from, we can enact some pretty problematic things. And so I think we need to be kind of always self-monitoring in the efforts. And we need to stop fetishization in its tracks. And I'll say often to folks in my world, when I hear it, of like, stop talking about Black men's bodies in ways that are oppressive and objectifying. And let's talk about why it is that you as a white person have such a oversimplified perspective of another person's life and experience and body. And I think we need to do that. And I think a lot of that work has to happen within white communities, because in my experience, a lot of the harm I've seen perpetuated happens when women, trans, and people of color are not in the space. And so we have to hold each other accountable as white folks, especially white cisgender queer people, to say like, nope, that talking about women that way, talking about trans people that way, talking about people of color that way is not okay. Let's help you find the words that are not patriarchal, sexist, and oppressive to unpack what you want, what you're actually doing here. Because I think in a lot of cases, as Joel mentioned, like, queer people are inclusive. I think we just are not aware of the ways in which oppression finds its way within us. And so we have to really hold ourselves as white folks in white spaces accountable.
Thank you so much, Justin. So Rita, for you, what can intercultural practitioners do to better amplify the voices of queer and trans people of color?
In 3 words, what Justin said. I mean, really, it does come down to everything you just said, Justin. To me, the oppression Olympics, we all agree that's not helpful at all. So let's leave that to the side. To me, still, as a white person, I'm on this journey of doing my own inner work. Yes, I don't want to do that just by myself in my little room here or my office, but I do need to stay in my office a little bit longer, I think, than most of us interculturalists are used to, because we're so used to like, well, give us the best practices, or what are some tools, or what are some strategies. And then we kind of go into action without really having reflected more deeply on what it is that, you know, our triggers, our discomfort, our dis-ease around these topics or this topic. And so I would say, let's keep ourselves locked up a little bit longer in our own spaces, not locked up in a bad way, but and do our own work. And I think that has to happen in white affinity groups, in white, whatever networks we are in, without, you know, running to our Black colleagues or Black, Joe, of course, exceptions are there. No, I'm kidding, but you know what I mean? So doing our own work first is really, really important in our white affinity groups, wherever we can find those, whether it's around a book group or some other network that you're part of. And just really, you know, it's not enough to just want to learn more, but it's like, where are your, you know, where are your reluctances? Where do you feel like you're not really stepping into it? And I think that's often around transgender culture, because, you know, it's kind of hip to be, you know, with this cool queer guy or a cool queer woman or gay woman or lesbian woman, whatever language you want to use. But when it comes to transgender rights, I think many of us are still reluctant to engage fully or to learn more, to, you know, see the struggles of transgender people. And, you know, what does allyship really mean? There's a new sort of way of thinking in the Black community that I've been made aware of. You know, you can be an ally and still be very white supremacist thinking, right? So what does real good allyship look like? Not defined by us white folks, but by, you know, people that we are wanting to be with, engage with on new territory, on new ground. So those kind of things I think we have to learn as interculturalists. First and foremost, inner work, you know, what does allyship in its new way look like? Where are our discomforts? How can we address those? And then, you know, think about best practices and those kinds of things later, if at all. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Rita. I think that is so important, right? That there's so much work that has to be done, and so much of that is the internal self-awareness piece. right? That we talk so much about in our own intercultural practice with our clients, and we forget that we all still have a lot of that work to do. So Joel, for you, what can SIETARians, all the people who are here and listening today and will listen in the future when we post this on our YouTube channel, what can we do to amplify the voices of queer and trans people of color?
Well, the first thing you can do is make sure you have a secure internet connection. I'm just joking. I've never had this problem before. But on a serious note, I really love what Rita said, because I am so tired of 5 steps of this, 7 best practices here, 3 things you can do. But I will say this, I think if we're going to have this conversation as interculturalist, and I don't know if I necessarily call myself an interculturalist, but I sit down with the cause, there has to be an element in the discussion around power and privilege. And that's one of the critiques and problems I've had with interculturalism since day one, is that there's a lack of thought around power and privilege. When we're talking about LGBTQ issues, and particularly within the community, one thing I would love people to recognize is that not everybody cares first. We need to recognize that. Sometimes there's this idea that, oh, you're a woman, you're Muslim, you're this, so therefore you like or care about these other issues. That doesn't necessarily translate. We also cannot assume that people understand. And so that's where the listening piece comes in. And I'm different than some people. I'm not one of these people who say that you have to go do your work before you have conversation with me. But when you have conversation with me, know that the work is listening. And it means that you have to understand that there's a different experience and that your experience is not normative. That's the main thing that I want people to be thinking about in terms of the community, is that what has been promulgated and disseminated is not the norm. We need to remove and deal with white centrality, cisgender centrality, and male centrality. And I think once that's done, it'll be much easier to have these conversations. It means talking with your friends, family, and loved ones. It means also examining your own relationship with race and ethnicity, which I know is a difficult thing to do. But we always, as a firm, always talk about going inside out instead of outside in. And I would say even for SIETARians who are just thinking about sexuality and gender identity overall, that's been one thing that has been a bias, to Rita's point. And Tamara, you know, I've had this conversation with you where people don't see queer people as having culture. And we have a culture that is no less important, no less vibrant, no less rich, and no less complex than the other cultures that are talked about readily within intercultural spaces. And so that's one thing too that I would add to this conversation. So thank you.
So thank you, Joel. Thank you, Justin and Rita, for this really important and powerful conversation. We now want to invite those of you who are still with us, the vast majority of you who are still here, to please use the Q&A feature or the chat, ideally the Q&A feature, to share a question for our panelists. We want to give each of them an opportunity to engage and interact with you all through a Q&A. And so we'll take those questions as they come in. One of the questions that came in earlier, that I don't know if it's rhetorical, but I'll add it here because it's, I'm sure, worth us thinking about. Can interculturalists, in parentheses, unlock outdated, obsolete cultural foundations, which so far have been part of the problem, rather than rise to the occasion and address moral, ethical, and human imperatives, such as racism, gender discrimination, and violence against women, addressing emerging social cultural trends associated with new and fast evolving digital culture?
So can I jump in? And one of the things that I'll add to what we were saying in that last question is, because I do sexuality work and that's like my primary focus, I'm constantly in places where just the conversation about sexuality itself or sex is already a smaller interest of the group, that, right? So like, it does not surprise me that this webinar might have lower attendance than other ones. It doesn't surprise me that when we have one in the US about sexuality similarly. And I think that interculturalists, like, yes, I agree with that question. I think some of it is rhetorical in nature, just because I agree that interculturalists have a worldview and an approach to their work that does hold the keys to unlocking some of the problematic interculturalist theories and approaches from the past. I also think we need to move from seeing LGBTQ related work as like a specialization of intercultural work. And we need to see that like all interculturalists do sexuality work, whether they realize it or not. And if they're not realizing it, what they're probably doing is reinforcing patriarchal cis hetero perspectives. And so I think we all need to start to take more of the share of the responsibility to center sexuality and gender as part of the work that we're doing. Because if we can't make more space for women to have access to their own bodies and their own rights and agency as people, then of course, LGBTQ folks are not going to have that same access. And so we have to see ourselves as not a subset. And it's great to be here. I'm glad we're doing this, but like, I would love to hear people talking about these topics in all the other sessions people are doing, right? And not just sort of like leaving it to these special circumstances. And I think there's some really interesting work being done from an Afrocentric perspective, from an Arab-centric perspective, from a Chinese-centric perspective around LGBTQ rights and liberation that is also really in need of amplification, because they really help us see that like when we set aside the European American quote unquote Western lens, there are all new things to learn about sex and sexuality that honestly the West could learn from and grow from and gain some resources to better address the moment. But we have to stop centering ourselves and our identity-based perspective on sexuality to be able to do that.
Thank you, Justin. Joel or Rita, did you want to respond?
Rita?
Actually, I don't have an answer that's going to be adding anything new to this question. So Joel, do you have any?
No, I'm complete. I think Justin summed it up well.
Great, thank you. And again, it looks like we don't have our regular Q&A feature, so go ahead and put any questions you may have into the chat. And I will say, I think Justin, 2 points you made that are really important food for thought, right? That I think also, right, is this idea of race, right? That we have kind of compartmentalized these aspects, right? So that, talking about race is a separate conversation, talking about sexuality is a separate conversation. And so part of, having this dialogue on intersectionality is to make us bring that awareness that we all have a responsibility in recognizing how we, as you said, and intentionally or unintentionally are reinforcing norms that are harmful to others. And I think without the people that I know within SIETAR, certainly the understanding and awareness I have, particularly around sexual orientation and gender identity, I would not have in any way without the people that I have learned from within SIETAR. And I perhaps sometimes don't acknowledge how powerful SIETAR has been in my own learning and understanding of difference, but it truly has. And I think to the point of this comment that we need to be having these conversations, as you said early, in a far more expansive way and a far more complex way, where we understand that all of these pieces fit together, right? And so we can't have a singular conversation on a singular topic, but that we have to be thinking about all of these pieces in every conversation whenever we are talking about culture or inequities or societal norms, and challenging those, and such a powerful reminder, because certainly I know that I have been having lots of conversation with folks who are struggling with And, you know, why are we focusing on race, or why can't we focus on this? And the focus sometimes helps us see the connections. And I think that's important. So we have a couple more questions have come in. So Dora has asked, I would love to have more details about the work on the African, Arab, Chinese perspectives on culture and sexuality that Justin mentioned. So is there a title or two that Dora can look up themselves?
Yes, if you give me a couple of minutes, I will put them in the chat. I'll put a couple of links for folks in the chat. I also wanted to just add to what you were saying, Tamara, that the conversations about how we create, like Rita earlier was talking about like the bars and how like bars have been such a center of queer culture for so long. In the fight for LGBTQ rights and equality, we often look at like the state, federal, like the governmental policy places. But because of the fact that LGBTQ folks have not been included in most of those big social policies, we have all kinds of norms and ways in which we set rules for ourselves because we're out of the watchful eye of like the public, right? So things like bar dress codes, like Rita mentioned, things like who's on the planning committee for Pride celebrations and how inclusive are those groups of queer and trans people of color. As Pride becomes a corporate thing, there are more white, cisgender, heterosexual people participating in Pride. In what ways does that marginalize, right, and decenter queer and trans people of color? So I think we have to really look within our own communities at our own policies. And Ibram Kenny's work on anti-racism really calls for us to move away from believing that diversity work is about teaching people to be good people in the world and really start thinking about ways we can systematize anti-racism and to create policies that center marginalized people so that the efforts live on beyond one well-meaning leader and move into institutionalizing this way of working and centering marginalized people. I'm going to be quiet now so I can find those resources.
Right. And there's a last question in the chat that is also looking for a resource on for Two-Spirited people or First Nations resources. So I want to put that in there while you're resource sharing. And then we have a question from Carlos. Don't you think that intercultural scholars develop national cultural typification, categories, labels, and stereotypes erected as immutable and fixed cultural dimensions as the only plausible reductionist response as to what it is to be human beings and what it is to be human? And then this reduces and fragments it into multidimensionality of our identity or identities as open, dynamic, and evolving.
I guess my only response to that statement is not the interculturalists who I think are doing really critical work. I mean, I think a lot of interculturalists recognize nuance and recognize I think, for example, a lot of people in recent years have criticized Hofstede, and I think their reading of Hofstede is frankly superficial. I don't think Hofstede was saying that these were fixed and immutable things. He was just saying that these are some things that are to be considered in terms of how you look at culture. He was looking at a very narrow subset. But to the question itself, I think there are a lot of great people who have helped to evolve the field forward enough where that is not taking place. It's not. Is there a danger? As always, yes. But to your statement, Carlos, I think there's a lot of great work now where people are pushing the field and saying we have to think about these things differently and recognizing intersectionality. So that's just my take on it.
And I just want to add too that I think that's really the only the way for us to still be relevant, which is what we're constantly sort of striving for and struggling with as interculturalists. And why haven't we been, in these major discussions in the public space? Because we haven't really probably addressed the topic of power privilege, as you were saying, Joel, in a way that needs to be done so that we are staying relevant. But I think for us, the intersectionality journey or path, that's for me the only way to actually become and stay relevant. And so whatever that means to us individually or as groups or as SIETAR, we have to figure that out. But I think that's clear, you know, we have to look at the entire picture. We have to look at where the intersections are, and you know, the sooner we start, the better, and the more we do it, the more deeply we do it, the better. So that's what I'm interested in, and what I want to push forward as well.
Well, I would love to thank the three of you for your incredible contributions today, for the vulnerability, honesty, and expertise that you have shared to host this conversation. I know that I certainly am wrestling with new ideas and questions, and also thinking about opportunities for my own learning and to share the learning that you've all shared with us today as an organization. And as a global network of people who are having conversations about how we're different and how we're similar. So I thank you once again for being part of this series. I want to thank all of you who have attended and been part of this conversation and engaged. There are some great resources being shared in the chat for those of you who are looking for additional resources. And I want to let all of you know who are still here that in May and June, we have a two-part series coming up on unconscious bias. So we have a session that is going to be presented that's really looking at the research and science behind unconscious bias in May, followed by a panel in June, hosted by Dr. Livingston Thompson. So both of those links are up on the website and open for registration. And also to let you all know that we are in the early stages of planning a virtual institute for the fall that will really bring together a lot of this thinking from the series over this past year, and how we can really focus and concentrate some time on going deeper into these topics. And I want to once again thank all of you for being here. I want to thank the SIETAR Europa board and our team and our committee who every month help us put this together. And once again, our esteemed panelists and SIETARians and friends and colleagues, thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Be well.
Bye, folks.